The tent had 30 men in it, most of them badly hurt. Captain Benjamin Salomon moved from one to the next in the lamplight, his hands doing the work his training had built them to do, triage in the small hours carrying forward through the dark. The sounds from the front had been intensifying since midnight. Not unusual, not yet alarming. Saipan had been a grinding day-and-night campaign for 22 days by this point, and gunfire in the small hours was the island's baseline condition. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The 105th Infantry Regiment of the 27th Infantry Division was dug in across the Tanapag Plain on the western coast, and the Japanese, crowded into the northern corner of the island with their backs to the sea, had been making noise every night for weeks. But this sound was different. It came from the north, and it was building, wave on wave, in a register that was not the crack of rifles or the thud of mortars. It was voices, thousands of voices. The battle cry Tenno Hika Banzai, long live the Emperor, rolling down the Tanapag Plain in the pre-dawn air toward the perimeter of the 1st and 2nd Battalions, toward the aid station where Salomon worked, toward everything and everyone behind them. It was not yet 5 in the morning. What happened next on the Tanapag Plain is remembered as the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. But the word Banzai carries a kind of cartoon framing, the image of a disorganized rush by fanatical men throwing their lives away in futile spectacle. What came down that plain on the morning of July 7, 1944 was different in intention and in scale. It was an ordered mass suicide attack, specifically designated by Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo as a Gyokusai, meaning to shatter like a jewel, an official command that every man on the island was to die in combat before surrendering. Between 3,000 and 5,000 Japanese soldiers and armed civilians moved south in the dark. Some were combat veterans. Many were walking wounded who had wrapped their injuries and picked up whatever was still at hand, including, by documented accounts, bayonets lashed to wooden poles and sharpened lengths of bamboo. They had drunk sake and heard their commanding general's last message, and now they came in masses that one American officer later compared to a cattle stampede in an old Western film, wave after wave, running over the bodies of those cut down in front of them. The question this story answers is not what the Japanese did that morning. The question is what happened to the men behind the front line when the front line broke. Saipan, the largest of the Mariana Islands, sat 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. In 1944, that distance was the whole strategic argument for taking it. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the longest-range heavy bomber the United States had put into the air, needed bases within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. Saipan's capture would put those bombers roughly 1,200 miles from Tokyo, close enough to begin the systematic fire raids that American planners believed would either break Japan's ability to sustain the war or force a decision about whether to invade the home islands outright. The island was not just territory. It was a runway pointed at Japan. The island had been under Japanese administration since 1919, mandated to Tokyo by the League of Nations after the First World War. In the 2 decades that followed, Japan had built sugar mills, airfields, and a civilian population of Japanese, Okinawan, and Chamorro residents. It was, in the official position of the Japanese government, sovereign territory, not a colonial acquisition, but Japanese ground. The political implications of losing it were catastrophic in ways that exceeded the military ones, which were themselves severe. The Japanese command understood this as clearly as the Americans did. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo had publicly sworn Saipan would never fall. The island was garrisoned by roughly 30,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors, nearly double the number American intelligence had estimated before the landings. Coastal defenses had been under construction for years. The terrain was punishing, a jumble of limestone hills, deep valleys that American soldiers would come to call Death Valley, and Purple Heart Ridge, sugarcane fields that swallowed whole columns and concealed machine gun positions, and cave systems that seemed to multiply the island's defenders no matter how many were killed. The Japanese had every natural advantage on Saipan and had prepared for American forces specifically. The landing on June 15, 1944 put 2 Marine divisions and the Army's 27th Infantry Division against those defenses. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, both seasoned from Tarawa and the Marshall Islands, hit the beaches first. The 27th Infantry Division, a New York National Guard outfit with much of its manpower drawn from the Troikos area of upstate New York, came in behind them as reserve and was committed to the center of the advancing line. Marine General Holland Smith, commanding the ground forces, held the Army's performance in low regard. A week into the battle, he relieved the 27th's commander, Major General Ralph Smith, in front of war correspondents who recorded the dismissal, triggering an inter-service controversy that persists in the histories to this day. Whether the criticism of the 27th was deserved remains genuinely contested. What the record shows is that the terrain assigned to the Army was among the hardest on the island, and that the soldiers of the 27th fought through 22 days of it without relief. The fighting across those 22 days had a particular texture that the men who survived it carried in their bodies for the rest of their lives. The sugarcane fields were tall enough to conceal a standing man and to hold Japanese fighting positions invisible from 10 yards. The caves opened in every hillside and could be cleared only by going into them, which produced casualties, or by sealing them with demolitions and flamethrowers, which produced time. Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge were not names the Army invented for atmosphere. They were terrain features that killed people in specific ways and generated specific body counts that the medical system was required to absorb. The casualties had been continuous for 3 weeks when July 6th arrived, and the 105th Infantry Regiment that held the Tanapag plain that night was a unit that had already given a great deal of what it had to give. The campaign had opened on June 15th with the Marine divisions taking losses on the beaches that exceeded what American planners had projected. Naval gunfire and carrier aircraft had pounded Saipan for days before the landing, but the Japanese had sheltered in caves and limestone positions that absorbed the bombardment and emerged intact when the Amtraks came in. Over 3,000 American casualties were counted on the first day alone. The days that followed were a grinding advance through terrain that rewarded defenders at nearly every point. Death Valley, a flat depression in the center of the island flanked by ridgelines where Japanese mortars and machine guns had unobstructed sight lines down into the valley floor, cost the 27th Division some of its heaviest casualties and became the specific ground cited when Holland Smith relieved the Army divisional commander. Whether the criticism was justified remains contested by historians who have studied the campaign records in detail. The 27th Division soldiers hold that the terrain was among the worst on the island, and that the daily casualties were what they were regardless of who commanded. Whatever the answer to that argument, the soldiers who crossed Death Valley crossed it, and they counted their dead afterward. By the time the 105th Infantry settled into its position on the Tanapag Plain in early July, the regiment had been fighting continuously for nearly 3 weeks in terrain that training cannot fully reproduce. The men in the foxholes on the night of July 6th were not fresh. They were the ones who had made it through. By the evening of July 6th, the island was largely in American hands. The Japanese had been pushed into a narrow strip along the northern coast, their supplies exhausted, their dead uncountable, many of the living armed with improvised weapons because the ammunition was gone. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, the Japanese commander, had looked at the arithmetic of what remained and understood it clearly. He drafted his last order to his troops that evening, then committed ceremonial suicide. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike group that hit Pearl Harbor in December 1941, also killed himself on Saipan that same evening. The command structure of the Japanese garrison had dissolved. What was left was the order and the men who had received it. Benjamin Louis Salomon was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on September 1st, 1914. He was an Eagle Scout, a capable athlete, and a focused student who transferred to the University of Southern California to finish his dental training. He graduated from the USC Dental School in 1937, opened a private practice, and by 1940 was building the kind of ordinary professional life that the Selective Service Act then interrupted. His draft notice arrived after the act took effect that fall. What the Army discovered when it processed Salomon as an infantry private was a man with unusual physical ability and a willingness to learn everything the service taught him and do it completely. His commanding officer at the 102nd Infantry Regiment noted him in writing as the best all-around soldier in the unit. He qualified expert with both rifle and pistol. Within a year, he had been promoted to sergeant and placed in charge of a machine gun section, responsible for a crew and a weapon and the tactical decisions about when and how to use it. He learned the Browning machine gun the way the Army taught it, which is through repetition at every stage until the process of loading, clearing, and firing the weapon requires no thought and can be executed under conditions that destroy thought. He learned the fields of fire, the traverse, the timing of the burst. In 1942, the Army determined it needed his dental skills more than his infantry skills, commissioned him as a first lieutenant in the Dental Corps, and shipped him to Hawaii. He served as regimental dental officer to the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division, beginning in 1943. He was promoted to captain in 1944. There is not much dental work in the middle of a Pacific campaign, and when the 2nd Battalion surgeon was wounded in a mortar attack on June 27, 1944, 10 days into the Saipan fighting, Salomon walked across the aid station and volunteered to replace him. He was 30 years old. He had a dental degree from USC and the reflexes of a trained machine gunner, a combination that no Army personnel system had anticipated, and that would matter precisely once. The other figures in this story belong to the combat structure of the 105th. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, 49 years old, had been with the New York National Guard since 1920. He commanded the 1st Battalion. He was not subtle. When he recognized a gap in his perimeter, he asked for troops to fill it, and, when none were sent, covered it with anti-tank guns and heavy automatic weapons, and told his crews to be ready for whatever came through. O'Brien was the kind of officer the record describes as leading from the front. He could be found at the worst positions during the worst moments rather than directing from the rear, and the men of the 1st Battalion understood this about him and responded to it in the way soldiers respond to officers who are actually present for the same experience the enlisted men are having. He had spent 24 years in the Guard before the war, rising through the ranks from private, learning the organization from its bottom. The 105th Regiment traced its lineage to the 2nd New York Infantry of the Spanish-American War, an old outfit with institutional memory, and the Troikahos Corps of the unit that had been federalized in 1940 brought with it the particular cohesion of men who had grown up in the same county, worked the same mills and shops, and in some cases were related to one another. The regiment knew itself, in other words, in a way that a scratch unit assembled from strangers does not. That knowledge had value on Saipan, and it had value on the night of July 6th. Private First Class Thomas Baker, 23 years old and from Troy like O'Brien, had already distinguished himself earlier in the campaign by attacking a Japanese strongpoint alone and destroying it. He was in his foxhole the night of July 6th, already carrying wounds from earlier action but not yet off the line. Before the battle, there is the myth the audience arrives with. The channel title for this story points toward a cook who grabbed a bar and walked out. The actual record, examined at its most documented point, shows a dentist who grabbed a machine gun and did not walk out. The broader phenomenon the title refers to is real and documented. As the Banzai swept through and past the American forward positions and rolled across the Tanapag plain, it overran supply depots, artillery positions, medical evacuation points, and every rear area function of a regiment that had been in continuous combat for 3 weeks. The men in those positions were not combat infantry. They were truck drivers, armorers, cooks, supply clerks, artillery crews, and administrative soldiers. When the front came to them, many of them picked up whatever weapons were available and used them. A bar from a fallen man, an M1 Garand from the ground, a carbine from a wounded soldier's hands. The Army's official historian, Captain Edmund G. Love, who was on Saipan for the entire campaign, documented dozens of these stands across the position. In account after account, the pattern is the same. A support soldier who stayed at his post, grabbed what was available, and kept firing until one condition or the other no longer held. What the title does not mention, because it could not fit, is that the most precisely documented of all these stands was conducted by a man whose only qualification for what he did was that the Army had once trained him to do it and then officially decided he was no longer needed for it. The Japanese who came for his tent discovered, at some cost, that the decision had been premature. The popular image of a Banzai charge as a disorganized rush of fanatics differs in important ways from what actually came down the Tanapag plain on July 7, 1944. The attack was a Gyokusai. a word that a Nisei interpreter working with American intelligence had specifically flagged in the days before the attack after hearing it from a Japanese civilian prisoner. The interpreter told his officers that a Gyokusai was not the same as an ordinary Banzai charge. A Gyokusai could only be ordered by Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The Japanese garrison on Saipan had not decided on their own to die. They had been ordered to, in language that specified both the manner and the purpose. Each man was ordered to take 7 American lives before giving his own. The order was transmitted through the chain of command to every unit and provisional formation that could still be reached. This distinction matters to the record because it changes the character of what the Americans were defending against. The men holding the line on July 7th were not waiting for a frenzied mob. They were in the path of an ordered military operation whose objective was their annihilation. The Japanese soldiers who received Saito's final order did not all receive it the same way. Sergeant Takeo Yamauchi, an infantryman of the 136th Infantry Regiment, whose account was recovered after the war, had not wanted to be on Saipan in the first place. He was a university student, a reader of Russian literature, drafted from the classroom with minimal training and shipped to the Central Pacific. He had resolved to surrender to the Americans as soon as a safe opportunity arose, and had spent weeks looking for that opportunity while surviving in the hills. When Saito's order was passed among the survivors, Yamauchi understood what general attack meant. He wrote afterward that in those days Japanese soldiers had genuinely accepted the idea that they must eventually die in battle. To be taken alive was to have failed both the emperor and one's own family. They had been sent off from their home villages with cheers of Banzai, with the ceremony of honorable departure, and to return as a prisoner was to return as something that had no place in the social reality waiting at home. Yamauchi would survive the night by hiding while the men around him charged. His account is one of the few that records the Gyokusai from inside the Japanese formation, and it describes most of the men he knew choosing the order over the alternative, and most of them dying before the sun came up. The evening of July 6th was quiet on the plain in the way that several soldiers and Marines noted afterward as a held breath. American intelligence had been reading the indicators. Forward observers reported movement from the direction of Makunsha, a village on the western coast near the northern tip of the island. Nisei interpreters listening on captured radio equipment had picked up fragmentary communications pointing toward a large assembly. O'Brien had looked at the gap between the 2 battalions that night, 200 yards or more of open ground across the plain, and had formally requested troops to close it. The request was denied. He positioned his anti-tank guns and heavy automatic weapons to cover the ground and walked his line one more time in the dark. At the northern end of the island, the Japanese were assembling by the thousands near Makunsha. Saito's last order had been carried forward by runners to every remaining position. His words to his men asked them to advance and deliver one more blow to the American forces, and to leave their bones on Saipan as a bulwark of the Pacific. The walking wounded had bound their injuries and picked up what was available. The quartermasters had distributed the last of the sake. American pickets in the hours after midnight reported hearing bottles and voices from the north, sounds that those who had been on the island long enough identified as something they had heard before, but not at this scale. The estimates of the Japanese force that assembled that night vary considerably across the sources. The Army's official history puts the attacking force at roughly 3,000 combatants. Other accounts, including testimony from American soldiers who watched them come and from Marines positioned on the high ground east of the plain, put the total at 5,000 or above, including armed civilians and walking wounded. Some estimates go higher still. The exact number will not be recovered from the record. What is documented is what that number produced when it moved. A survivor of the 1st Battalion, 24th Marines, positioned on high ground east of the plain, described watching the charge from above. What he could see from elevation was a mass moving south in the pre-dawn dark that he could not resolve into individual figures but could track by sound and by the intermittent light of star shells fired by the destroyers offshore. The destroyers had been alerted to movement on the plain and were putting up illumination as well as high explosive rounds, and the brief bursts of light showed the ground below in strobe-like snapshots. The Japanese in dense formation moving south, the American positions flanking the gap, the space between them already full of men in contact. One Marine officer watching from the high ground said it reminded him of a football game scene from the upper deck, except that the field below had no boundary line and the crowd was not stopping at the end zone. The Japanese who were fully armed moved in the front of the formation. Behind them came the men with improvised weapons and the men with no weapons at all, advancing in the same direction because the order had said advance, and the men ahead of them were advancing, and there was no other direction available. American forward observers who survived the initial impact of the charge reported that the Japanese were shouting and screaming throughout the assault, the noise maintaining itself at a level that some soldiers described afterward as disorienting in its own right, a wall of sound preceding the physical contact by seconds. In Salomon's aid station, 50 yards behind the 2nd Battalion's forward foxhole line and 30 yards from the shoreline, the night was occupied with work. Roughly 30 wounded men lay in the tent, most of them from the previous weeks of fighting. Some could not move. Some had been carried in by their comrades earlier that day. The aid station was a single canvas tent lit by a lantern. It was not fortified. It was not defended. It was a tent on flat ground on the edge of a plain. Behind it, in the American rear areas, the cooks and supply sergeants and clerks of the regiment were asleep or standing watch or moving material in the dark, doing what rear area soldiers do between battles, which is to say everything the combat soldiers never see and always require. The Browning automatic rifles and M1 Garrons belonging to the wounded and the dead were stacked against crates, leaned against tent poles, or lying where they had been set down by men too exhausted to secure them properly. The artillery pieces of the 10th Marine Regiment were positioned further south, the gunners sleeping by their guns. The plain smelled of volcanic soil and the salt air off the Pacific and, underneath both, the persistent smell that 3 weeks of continuous combat had laid across Saipan, and that could not be identified by anyone who had not experienced it before and could not be forgotten by anyone who had. Outside, somewhere in the dark of the northern plain, the formation had stopped talking and started chanting. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. At approximately 0400 hours on July 7, 1944, the forward observers of the 105th Infantry reported a large mass of movement to their front. At approximately 0445, the screaming began in earnest. Major Edward McCarthy, commanding the 2nd Battalion, heard it and later described the attacks opening in a phrase that was quoted in multiple after-action reports. "It reminded me of one of those old cattle stampede scenes of the movies," he said. "The camera is in a hole in the ground, and you see the herd coming, and then they leap up and over you and are gone. Only the Japs just kept coming and coming. I didn't think they'd ever stop." He ordered a withdrawal. The attempt disorganized quickly in the dark and heavy fire from all directions. McCarthy moved into the open where his men could see him and tried to rally them around a new defensive line. The gap between the two battalions, the gap O'Brien had tried to fill and been denied the troops to fill, was found by the Japanese within minutes. The attack poured through it and split the regiment. Men in foxholes on both sides found themselves cut off in the dark, surrounded, firing at silhouettes and muzzle flashes from multiple directions. Some fought where they stood. Some fell back to the shore and waded into the Pacific, the destroyers offshore already sending boats. The Army's official historian documented account after account of soldiers found the following day surrounded by the Japanese dead, their weapons empty, their own bodies marking how long they had stayed before the end found them. Near the 2nd Battalion's position, the crew of a 37mm anti-tank gun had been positioned specifically to cover the open ground between the two battalions. The crew had been firing canister shot directly into the advancing Japanese from the first moments of the attack. The anti-tank gun's flat trajectory and wide canister spread made it effective against dense infantry in a way the weapon's intended role against armor did not suggest, and the rounds tore through the front of the Japanese formation repeatedly. The crew was picked off through the morning as Japanese infantry worked around the position's flanks. The last man standing at the gun was replaced by the next available man. The gun kept firing until there was no one left to fire it. The destroyers offshore, alerted to the attack, had been putting high explosive rounds and star shells across the beach into the plain since the early hours. Naval gunfire at night, firing across the line of troops in contact, on targets identified by intermittent observation and radio reports from men under immediate pressure, is imprecise by necessity. The shells fell into the Japanese formations, into the no-man's ground between the sides, and occasionally into positions that were no longer clearly in one side's possession. The officers coordinating the fire adjusted as fast as the communications allowed. The destroyers kept firing because no naval gunfire support was worse than imperfect naval gunfire support, and the men on the plane needed whatever was available. In the aid station tent, Salomon was still working on a patient when the first Japanese soldier crawled under the canvas wall. What happened over the next several minutes has been documented in the Medal of Honor citation awarded posthumously in 2002, in the sworn testimony of survivors, and in the physical evidence recovered when Army teams returned to the site days later. The reconstruction carries the weight of multiple independent accounts that agreed on the main events. Salomon saw the soldier crawling into the tent and threw a surgical pan at him. He grabbed a carbine lying near one of the wounded men and shot the intruder. 2 more soldiers appeared at the front entrance of the tent. He killed them. 4 more crawled under the tent walls, and this time Salomon did not reach for the carbine first. He kicked the knife from the hand of one, shot a second, and bayonet a third. The fourth he drove back with a rifle butt. A wounded man lying on the floor of the tent shot the 4th soldier dead. Salomon ordered the evacuation. He told every man in the tent who could move to make his way toward the regimental aid station. He told the men who could not move to hold on. He grabbed the rifle he had used and walked out of the tent. Outside, 50 feet from the aid station, a .30 caliber water-cooled Browning machine gun was at its position. 4 American soldiers had died trying to man it. Salomon reached the gun and took over. He fired from outside the tent, covering the ground behind it, giving the men still moving through the dark toward the rear the time they needed. The water-cooled Browning is a weapon built for sustained fire. Its water jacket prevents the barrel from overheating in the way an air-cooled weapon will, which means a man behind it can keep firing far longer than an air-cooled gun would allow. It is also a heavy, fixed weapon that cannot be repositioned quickly, and anyone operating it is both effective and exposed. Salomon had been a machine gun section leader before the Army moved him to the Dental Corps. He understood what the gun could do and what it cost to stay behind it. He had learned it the way the Army teaches such things, through repetition until the knowledge lives in the body rather than the mind. He stayed behind the gun. What he was firing at was not invisible. The Japanese who had pushed into and through the gap between the battalions were flowing around the regimental rear, and some of them were directed toward the aid station because a tent with a lantern in it is visible in the dark from a distance. The machine gun covered the tent's rear approach. The fire it produced did not require precision in the technical sense. A water-cooled Browning operating at close range into a target-dense environment is accurate enough by the nature of the situation. What it required was that someone keep feeding the belt and keep the barrel pointed in the right direction. The 4 men who had died at the gun before Salomon reached it had been doing exactly that. The record does not preserve their names in all cases. The Medal of Honor citation notes that 4 men were killed at the gun before Salomon took it over, and that the gun was still functional when he arrived. 4 soldiers died at that position to keep it in action before Salomon got there. He made it 5. The difference is that when the gun went silent for the last time, the evacuation of the aid station was complete and the wounded were no longer in the tent. To the south and west of Salomon's position, Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien was conducting a different kind of stand. He had taken a bullet in the shoulder and refused evacuation. He moved among his men directing the defense with a pistol in each hand, the second taken from a fallen soldier when the first ran dry. He found an abandoned jeep with a .50 caliber machine gun mounted in the rear. He climbed up behind the gun and fired into the masses coming across the plain. A .50 caliber round is large enough to pass through several men in sequence. O'Brien fired until he was no longer able to fire. His body was found the following day by burial parties, surrounded by the Japanese dead. Thomas Baker's end is documented in his Medal of Honor citation and in the accounts of the men with him. Baker was wounded too badly to walk. He refused to let the men beside him carry him during the withdrawal, knowing that carrying him would slow them and put their lives at greater risk than they already faced. He told them to prop him against a tree at the edge of the position and leave him his pistol loaded. The soldiers who found Baker the next day found him dead at the base of the tree. His pistol was empty. 8 Japanese soldiers lay around him. The charge had pushed past the 105th's positions. In the rear, the 3rd Battalion of the 10th Marine Regiment, the Artillery Regiment of the 2nd Marine Division, was the next formation in the path of the wave. The Marines were firing their 105mm howitzers at direct fire, flat trajectory, into the oncoming masses at ranges they could see. Normally, an artillery crew fires at targets miles away and measures results in map coordinates. The gunners of the 10th Marines were firing at Japanese soldiers they could watch crossing the plain toward them, loading and cycling the breach as fast as the mechanism allowed, burning through ammunition at rates the supply system could not sustain. The howitzer batteries were overrun. The Marines formed into pockets with rifles and pistols and fought in that configuration through the morning. Some destroyed their guns before the Japanese could take them intact. A number of Marines were found the following day who had died in close quarters fighting, their ammunition gone. The 10th Marines had not been positioned or trained to fight as infantry in a ground assault. They were an artillery regiment, and everything about their organization, their equipment, their doctrine, pointed toward fire support rather than direct combat. When the howitzer batteries were overrun, what remained was the basic Marine Corps instruction that every Marine is a rifleman first, the rifle qualification and the infantry fundamentals that are built into every Marine regardless of specialty. The Marines fought from behind overrun guns, and from shell craters, and from whatever cover the flat plain provided. Several battery positions held as isolated pockets for hours after the surrounding ground was taken, the Marines inside firing until their rifle ammunition ran out, then using sidearms, then using whatever was at hand in the positions. The official accounts credit the 10th Marines with halting the deepest penetration of the charge at their lines. Whether that credit fully survives scrutiny against the documentary record is difficult to determine at this distance. But what the record is clear on is that the Japanese advance did not push past the 10th Marines' positions in any organized and continuing way, and that the Marines who held those positions paid for the result in the same currency as the soldiers of the 105th. The charge had pushed over 1,000 yards south of its starting point. In the supply areas and the mess positions and the evacuation points behind the artillery, the men who had no combat assignment that morning found themselves in the middle of one. Cooks and supply clerks and administrative soldiers, men whose training had covered their assigned duties and not this, grabbed whatever weapons were at hand. A bar from a dead man's position, an M1 from the ground, a carbine from a wounded soldier's equipment. The Army's official historian, Captain Edmund G. Love, documented dozens of these individual stands across the position in the hours that followed. In almost every case, a man who had held his ground and fired until one thing or the other ran out. Some of those men survived. Some did not. Many of their names are in the records. Many are not. What the record captures most consistently about these men is not heroism in the theatrical sense, but something more pragmatic. A cook does not train for the moment when the regiment's front line collapses and several thousand Japanese soldiers pour through the gap and head for the rear. Nothing in Army basic training or in a week of weapons qualification prepares a man specifically for that. What those men had was the weapon at arm's reach and the particular clarity that comes when the situation has run out of alternatives. The men found dead the following day across the supply areas and evacuation points of the Tanapag plain were found with their weapons empty. Whatever they had, they used it. The bar that a bar gunner fires in a defensive position is the same weapon regardless of the gunner's military occupational specialty. By mid-morning, the Japanese charge was losing momentum. The men who had started running at 0400 had been running for hours, many of them already wounded before the attack began, many of their improvised weapons good only for close quarters. American destroyers offshore had been shelling the plain since the attack began, their guns reaching across the beach into the Japanese formations. The pockets of Marines from the 10th Regiment were still fighting from their positions. The surviving soldiers of the 105th, those who had not swum to the destroyers or been killed in the initial overrun, had reformed behind the artillery line and were fighting back northward through the chaos of the plain. The mid-morning phase of the battle, as the charge's forward momentum ran out, produced its own set of engagements. Japanese soldiers who had been moving since before dawn were now scattered across 1,000 yards of terrain, separated from any organized formation, many of them wounded, many carrying weapons that were empty or improvised. Some continued to fight from where they had stopped. Some lay down where they were. A few, according to accounts from American soldiers who encountered them, made gestures that appeared to be surrender attempts, though the chaos of the morning and the darkness that had preceded it made distinguishing a man attempting to give up from a man preparing to attack a judgment call that had to be made in seconds. The killing continued through the morning. The destroyers adjusted their fire throughout the engagement as communications improved and American unit positions became clearer. By mid-morning, the naval shells were falling more reliably on Japanese-held ground. The artillery of Marine and Army units not directly involved in the charge had begun registering on the plain from the flanks, adding to the fire now working against a Japanese force that had no line of retreat, no supply, and no organized command remaining to direct what any individual survivor should do next. The charge had not stopped at a moment any observer could pinpoint. It had simply exhausted itself against what was in front of it. By late morning, the forward edge of the Japanese charge was no longer moving. By 1800 hours on July 7, 1944, American units had retaken all the ground the charge had covered. The Tanapag plain was quiet for the first time since before the sun had come up. The count of the Japanese dead on the field was 4,311 confirmed bodies, documented in the Army's official records. Approximately 2,295 had been killed in front of the 105th's original position. Another 2,016 were found further to the rear, in the ground the charge had pushed through after overrunning the front line. The figure represents the documented dead, not the full measure of those who had charged. The American losses in the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry alone were 406 killed and 512 wounded, the near destruction of 2 combat battalions in a single engagement lasting roughly 15 hours. The plain itself was almost incomprehensible to the soldiers and Marines who walked it the following day. A combat artist named Robert Benny, who had witnessed the aftermath, described the scene afterward. The Japanese dead lay in heaps across the ground in patterns that told the story of where the fighting had been thickest. Weapons were scattered throughout, rifles and swords and bayonets, and the improvised poles with blades tied to them that some of the attackers had carried. The destroyers had been shelling through the night, and the naval gunfire had cut corridors through the field. Where the 10th Marines had fired their howitzers at direct fire, the ground ahead of the gun positions showed the radius of canister shot and high explosive rounds fired at ranges measured in yards instead of miles. Survivors of the 105th Infantry who had waded into the Pacific during the battle were pulled from the water by small boats and returned to shore. Some of them had swum several hundred yards in the dark, past the reef, holding their weapons out of the water. Salomon's body was found when Army teams returned to clear the position days later. He was slumped over the machine gun. The bodies of 98 Japanese soldiers were piled in the space in front of his position. His own body carried 76 bullet wounds and multiple bayonet strikes, the physical record of an engagement that had continued at close range after his capacity to respond to it was gone. The machine gun was empty. The wounded who had been evacuated from the aid station survived. The men who crawled or were carried toward the regimental position through the dark while the machine gun fired behind them reached it. Exactly how many completed the journey is not documented with full precision, but the evacuation was complete before the aid station position was overrun, which was the purpose Salomon had in mind when he stayed at the gun. The survivors of the 105th Infantry who had waded into the Pacific during the night were pulled from the water by small boats from the destroyers and brought back to shore on the morning of July 8th. Some of them had been in the water for several hours. Some had swum past the reef. They came back onto the beach at Tanapag and stood in the morning sun and looked at what the plain had become, and the official historian who was there to document the campaign wrote that the men who had lived through the night were in a condition that no amount of training or prior experience had fully prepared them for. They were not the same unit that had been there the day before. They were what remained of that unit, which is a different thing. The Army recommended Benjamin Salomon for the Medal of Honor in 1944. The recommendation was denied. The objection was grounded in the Geneva Convention, which restricts medical personnel from using crew-served weapons in combat, permitting medical officers only pistols and rifles in direct defense of their patients. The Army's legal review concluded that manning a machine gun placed Salomon outside the convention's protections and outside the eligibility for the award, and the recommendation was returned. What followed over the next 58 years is a story within the story. Veterans of the 105th Infantry who had survived the Banzai, some of the men whose lives the machine gun had bought time for, pressed the recommendation forward through the formal channels more than once in the decades after the war. Each time, the Geneva Convention objection came back. In 1998, Dr. Robert West of the USC Dental School, Salomon's alma mater, brought the case to a United States congressman. The congressman's office requested a formal legal review that weighed a distinction the earlier denials had not fully engaged, that Salomon's use of the machine gun had not been an offensive combat action, but a specific defensive act on behalf of patients who were being bayoneted in their beds. The distinction between using a crew-served weapon to advance against an enemy and using one to hold a position while wounded patients escaped on their hands and knees is a real legal distinction, and the 2002 review drew it differently than the 1944 review had. On May 1, 2002, President George W. Bush presented the posthumous Medal of Honor to Salomon's family at a White House ceremony. He became the only dentist in the history of the United States Army to receive it. Some of the men who attended that ceremony were veterans of the 105th Infantry who had been on the Tanapag plane that morning. A few of them had been among the wounded in the tent. They had spent 58 years knowing what Salomon had done and watching the official record fail to say so. What the 2002 ceremony gave them was not new information. It was acknowledgement, which is a different thing, in which the men who were there understood in ways that the ceremony itself could not fully communicate. The strategic consequences of what was defended on the Tanapag plane that morning were not visible to the men defending it. They are visible now. Within 11 days of Saipan being declared secure on July 9, news of the island's fall reached Tokyo. Prime Minister Tojo, who had sworn publicly it would not fall, resigned on July 18. His government collapsed. For the first time in the war, Japanese state media acknowledged to the Japanese public that the war was going poorly. The language was official and controlled, but the fact was communicated. Saipan had changed what was sayable in Japan about the war's direction. The first B-29 superfortresses based on Saipan struck targets in the Japanese home islands before 1944 was out. The Great Fire raids that would reduce large portions of Tokyo and other Japanese cities through the winter and spring of 1945 were flown in significant part from the Marianas. The atomic bombs were staged through Tinian, the island visible from Saipan's shore. The line connecting the 15 hours on the Tanapag plain to the end of the war in the Pacific is not a straight line, but it is a real one. The men who fought on July 7th did not know what they were fighting for in the strategic sense. They knew they were fighting for the man beside them and the wounded men in the tent and the position they had been given to hold. That knowledge was enough to make them do what they did. The record shows this with a clarity that the larger history sometimes obscures. The names that belong here are the names the record documents most fully. Benjamin Lewis Salomon of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 30 years old on the morning of July 7, 1944. He had trained as a dentist and as an infantryman, and he died as both, in the most precise sense available to a man who had mastered two entirely different sets of skills and then found, in a single night, that both of them were needed at exactly the same time. His Medal of Honor, delayed by more than half a century, was the Army finally catching up to what the men who were there already knew. William J. O'Brien of Troy, New York, 49 years old, who commanded the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry Regiment, and who died on the Tanapag plain with his battalion around him after a fight that none of the veterans who witnessed it ever stopped talking about. Posthumous Medal of Honor, 1944. Thomas Baker of Troy, New York, 23 years old, who declined to be carried and asked only to be left with a loaded pistol and enough room to use it. Posthumous Medal of Honor, 1944. The 406 soldiers of the 1st and 2nd Battalions, 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division, killed on July 7, 1944, along with the 512 wounded. The cooks, the supply clerks, the artillerymen, and the support soldiers across the Tanapag plain who grabbed what weapons were at hand when the line came to them. Their names are in the records. The records are there to be consulted. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.